So this video feels like it's a long time coming because in the past, I have basically taken a look at each of the different types of, let's say, fire Toa that were introduced in Generation 1 Bionicle. And so I thought to myself, I often find myself coming back to compare the Generation 1 Toa masks, the Mata masks, and the Generation 2 Master masks, which I think actually do a pretty good job of representing the characters. So why not make a video out of it? Why not talk to you about which masks I might prefer over Generation 1? Pretty crazy to think about it. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get right on into it. And of course, if you enjoy this type of content, make sure you're subscribed. It really helps. And yeah, the algorithm loves it. All right. So we're going to hop in first with the flagship, the main character, the poster child, if you will, of Bionicle for both series. This mask right here is the Mask of Protection, the How, or Mask of Fire, if you're looking at Generation 2. And I don't know why this picture specifically shows a hole in the top of the mask, because in this mask, in Generation 2, that hole is filled in. Still, though, I do think it's a pretty good representation. However, I do have one problem with Generation 2's version of the How. It's this massive jawline. It's not a bad thing. If you like that aesthetic, I can absolutely see why. And it has a little bit more of a futuristic, maybe, aesthetic to it, probably because of the sharper angles, all told. And obviously that leans quite well into CCBS, which uses some pretty angular, well, shells, right? So I think this is actually pretty fitting. You could definitely go both ways on this one. However, I have to say my favorite here is going to be the original Mata How. Not only is it iconic, not only am I nostalgic for it, this was the very first mask I ever owned from Bionicle, all the way back in 2001. Very first set was Tahu Mata. But also, I just like the simplicity of this mask. There's a reason it's as iconic as it is. And I do apologize for some of the photos looking a little bit kind of weird and some of the colors and sharp angles being a little hard to tell. I actually had to go in and edit these pretty heavily because it turns out it can be kind of hard to find versions of these on Google and online in general that are roughly comparable in size. Also, the gold, well, Generation 2 masks are pretty much all that face forward, so I had to actually edit and add color in after the fact, which is a little more difficult than I expected it to be. With all that said, though, I'm going to give my points here to the original How Mata. Rightfully so, in my opinion. Let's go ahead and move on to the next mask, the Parari. And this is actually harder for me because I am a huge fan, a big stan of the Generation 2 Parari as well. I love its small size, and I know a lot of people pick on it for being as small as it is, but I think it actually really works with Onua. That small head helps to, ground the character more, in my opinion, instead of just making him look like a big dumb brute, which, I mean, he can, for sure. It helps to make him feel like, yes, but there's still a charming little guy inside of this big body. And I really enjoy it. Of course, if you wanted a larger version of this mask, Generation 2 still has you covered with the Onua Uniter mask, and that's a pretty good representation of it as well. Definitely not the size of the original Parari, but it's getting much closer. That said, I love the small size of that Generation 2 Parari. However, I don't know that I like it more overall. It's really, really hard to say. And I have to commend the designers for this design overall with Generation 2's Parari because I really like it. To me, and I think this could change by the day, I do like the original Parari just a little bit more. I think it's mainly down to the angles being a little bit easier to understand. There are some pretty compound angles on the Generation 2 Parari and really the Generation 2 masks in general, which I actually find quite charming. However, in this case here, there's just a lot of them. But you could definitely go both ways. I could go both ways. And I like to treat these masks as great and noble versions of the same mask for Generation 1. That smaller Parari really fits the role of being a noble mask. And it looks great among all of the other masks. I'm very thankful it's made out of ABS as well and not polypropylene, so it helps to preserve those sharper angles and, of course, resist scratches much better than polypropylene can, in my opinion. And it also tends to just be a more opaque plastic overall, but that's, neither here nor there. So I'm going to give my points again to the Parari Mata, but this is just barely that holds up pretty well in my opinion. Moving on to the next mask, we have the Kakama. This one was a little bit hard to edit. As you can tell, that dark orange over top of a gold, it's actually pretty hard to capture, in my opinion, at least from what I was doing. Surely you can do it better in other programs, but I am just using paint.net and it works fine for me. Also, this is supposed to be brown, but to you guys it might appear dark orange, and I do apologize for that. That's just the settings on OBS as well, which I've made for the, for my channel's videos in general. Bear with me though. Dark orange is a good representation for both of these. Both masks are available. And this is kind of the same story here as well. When I was looking at Bionicle in 2014, the leaks for this, I was really excited for this mask because it looks so close to the original. And there are a lot of little tiny features about that Generation 2 Kakama that I really admire. The hexagonal or octagonal, I guess, mouth shape, which is so subtle, but it is there when you actually look. And it's also a theme that's carried over to another mask, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is another one that honestly, I think it could go both ways. The original Kakama obviously is, again, going to have a bit of nostalgia for me, and I do think I like it better overall. But I would not blame you if you picked the latter. They are both excellent masks. Obviously, the latter mask is a little bit more round, being sort of a hexagonal shape overall, and a bit deeper. It's a bit longer, which I like. It kind of looks fast. I love that the Kakama is the mask of speed, but of course, if you just look at this mask alone, it doesn't look like it's flying through any, speed force or whatever you want to call it, That second one, though, does. It looks aggressive, but in the right kind of way. And again, this is the type of mask that I like to treat as a great and noble mask as well. So I am giving my points here to this one a little more solidly than last time. I think I do like this Kakama better overall, but that's pretty close. It's not bad. So far, if I had to pick favorites from where we're at right now for Generation 2 masks, Parari is number one from what we've seen so far, then Kakama, then How. But there are 3 more masks. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one here. Liwa's mask. And I apologize again for the details on these. These masks are about 100 pixels online. They're very small, and so I had to go through the effort of actually enlarging them, but it does mean losing some details. If you're familiar with the Miru from Generation 1, it should have a ridge down the center of the mask, and in fact should have some sections on the front of the head that, depending on the version of the mask you have, are matte in texture, or at least more matte than the rest of the mask. And I say version because I covered this in another video, but if you missed it, there are 2 versions of, as far as I know, every single Toa Mata and Turaga mask from 2001. Some revisions were made to change a couple of things, and I really appreciate that. You can learn more about that in that video, which I'll try and link at the end of this one. But suffice to say, there's something I've neglected to mention about all of the Generation 2 masks to this point, at least the master masks. Matte textures. Something that I really enjoyed about 2001's masks is the use of matte textures to relay extra detail, where otherwise there would be none. The Kakama is a great example of this, having an almost entirely matte mask with just a strip down the center being glossy. The Cow, same kind of thing. The lens of the actual, goggles are glossy while the rest of the mask is matte. And it really goes a long way to selling the fact that those goggles are, in fact, goggles, even though it is a one-piece mask overall. Generation 2's masks, however, though they introduce matte textures, they don't do so until the Skull Villain sets. And that's admittedly pretty cool. I guess technically the Skull Spider also has a little bit of a matte texture. So having those textures on villain sets is a neat idea at the very least, but I do think some of these master masks are lacking because of, that lack of matte textures. That said, I don't think it's anything that you're going to miss, and it's very easy to overlook this fact in general. So looking at the Mirus here, this one is a little more easy for me to pick, a little bit more clear-cut, and so far we have stuck with the Generation 1 masks, and the same is true here. I love the design of the original Miru, that bird beak kind of design that is so iconic for this mask as the sort of sub-leader, if you want, of the original Toa Mata. And it has just that much more, I want to say jolly, because that's kind of how I picture Liwa from Generation 1. He's a very fun character. And this holds true. It looks great on this mask. I'm not the biggest fan of this one, I'll be honest. It might actually be my least favorite mask from Generation 2 of the Master Mask so far. And that's not to say that it's a bad mask, because I don't think that it is. It actually has a lot of similarities to the original Miru. As you can see, the original Miru has most of a dome shape, a half oval, if you will, but then has this sort of segmented jawline, which is shared with the Miru from Generation 2. However, you can see these sort of side thrusters. What do you want to call those? You know, it is reminiscent of some things that have appeared on other air character masks. However, in this case, because of the way that the Liwa master set is built, they often get in the way. Not a big fan of that. That said, they don't look bad on their own. The other thing that I find interesting, fascinating even, about this mask is obviously this has smaller eye holes, smaller grin, if you want to call it that, on the front of the mask there. But it sort of has this pleated design that somewhat suggests that maybe in the story that can open up. And that would be a cool idea in concept, assuming that there's maybe a visor or something under it. That'd be pretty neat. And I could definitely imagine that. That said, do I prefer it? No. I like the aesthetic, and I even like that pleated design. I think there is something interesting there. This is a type of mask that I think needs just a little bit more work, but it is respectable at the very least, and definitely the closest thing we've gotten to a Miru that's noble, let's say. Technically, we got a noble Miru on Tanma all the way back in 2008, but this looks much closer. So I will definitely say, if this is your favorite version of the Miru, you're definitely not wrong. It is a good, solid mask overall. None of these masks are bad, I want to preface. So, again, the points here are going to the Mata masks. But next up, that means 4 for the Mata mask so far. And, of course, this is going to be on the bottom of my list of favorites that we've seen so far. But let's go ahead and move on to the Akaku. This is a good representation, in my opinion, of the original mask. It carries over so many details from the original. Not all of them, of course. It does miss those little cheek lines, if you want to call it that. But even the little circular divots below the mouth area are pretty cool. And again, that actually has a somewhat hexagonal shape. Actually, I think it might be odd sides, but don't quote me on that. I'm not looking at the mask right now. This is a really good design, in my opinion. And I'm going to be controversial here. I think I like this one better, which is crazy. The Akaku has obviously been with us for a very long time. My very first McDonald's Matoran was, in fact, Matoro, and sand blue is a gorgeous color, by the way. We should have gotten more colors for these masks, but that's for a different day. That said, though, there's just something about this one I like. It obviously carries over some traits also from the Nuva version of the mask, more or less the shape of it being, again, that sort of semi-oval shaped head rather than the circle. And as you've noticed, if you've looked at any of my Rahi, of which 199 is a pretty crazy amount, the versions of Rahi that I have built, that I have designed that wear masks, none wear the Akaku. That is not because I dislike this mask, but mostly because of that asymmetry. It looks a little too mechanical for what I tend to design when I usually go for a more naturalistic look for the animals that I design. That said, I love the smoothness of this mask. Obviously, the white color is a little more crisp as well, because Lego's white has changed over time to be less susceptible to yellowing as time has gone on, and I really appreciate that as well. The Akaku also does have that matte texture, although it can be a little bit hard to see at first. It's mostly relegated to the sides of the scope area, and obviously the scope here is stretched out. But I don't mind that. In fact, that empty space feels right. You know, it's hard to say, because it'd be very easy, very tempting to fill that space in with wires or something else. Lego's done it in the past, but this is a good way of packing a lot of detail into a mask while leaving a lot of open space. Well, just able to sing, able to really show itself, and I appreciate all of it. I'm giving this point to the Generation 2 Akaku. It's a great mask, but again, either you're going to be happy with. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and move on to this one right here, the Cow Cow, or Mask of Water. This one is a little bit more controversial. On first glance, it does not look a lot like the original mask, and I think that that is absolutely true. It's also probably the most complicated in shape of any of the Generation 2 masks, and of course, at least out of the box, is not transparent. That is fine to me personally. And thankfully, LEGO would at the very least give us a poly bag with the Mask of Fire in a transparent color if we really wanted something like that. And thankfully, that's relatively cheap to get your hands on, even today. Over time, this mask has definitely grown on me, and it does have, some people have said, a feminine shape to it, and I completely agree with that. Though I don't really go out of my way to look for that kind of stuff. These, at the end of the day, to me, are robots. It doesn't matter what they look like, you know. As long as I aesthetically am pleased with the mask, I'm going to be happy with it. And I think this is a good mask overall. Something that might ruin this mask for you, though, and this is something that I discovered, gosh, a couple of years ago, right above the mouth here, there's a little tiny divot. Well, actually, a protrusion. I think this is, honestly, a nod to probably the most controversial mask from Generation 1 Bionicle. This one right here. You can see that this has a mold mark on the front of the mask, which I find odd because these masks are designed specifically to be able to hide that mold mark, but LEGO still put it on the front of the mask. Obviously, it is asymmetrical and it's on that same side near-ish where the mouth would be, and you can find that protrusion here as well. Well, this is a cow, technically, as much as I might dislike the fact. To see it here is kind of cute, and it's not something that bothers me, even though typically asymmetry for no reason does. It's so small here, and it's very clearly a nod, at least in my opinion. I could be completely wrong. Maybe it serves some kind of purpose, but it doesn't have to be there. So the fact that it is just tells me, yeah, we know the history of this one, and I like that. I also, of course, like those slits in the sides of the cheeks, those forehead vents there as well, which somewhat harken back to the Cow Nuva, having a little bit more openings, and even the orientation of some of these as well. This one does have a bit more of an angular jawline, but you can see the suggestion of a triangular shaped mouth, which I also really appreciate. So there are details here that are reminiscent of the original 2001 version of the mask. I think this is a good mask overall. I am still going to put my finger on this one, just barely though. The Cow is another mask I don't tend to use that often. Again, kind of the same reason. I usually don't use transparent masks unless I use them for eyes, and because this mask is quite angular, where masks like the Ruru from the Nui Rama or the Trans Neon Green Mirror are quite smooth. Those make exceptional eyepieces, but this one is available in a lot of transparent colors, which means it is a very useful mask overall. This Cow obviously is technically available in trans dark blue, although I do not like how LEGO handled that, seeing that it's a mask that's definitely, well, they should have known would have been in demand at the time. That said, if I had to place this one on my listing of favorites to least favorites of the original Generation 2 Master Masks, I still think it goes kind of towards the bottom, but I don't think it's my least favorite. So here's my listing so far. Of the Generation 2 masks, my favorite in terms of design is probably the Parari. The Akaku is close. The only thing holding it back, even though it is definitely the one I prefer more than the Mata version, is again that asymmetry. That's not the fault of the mask. It's iconic for that reason. And so I think it deserves to be there. Rather, the reason I mention it is just because I don't use it as often, and so it pulls it down for me. But it's not a bad thing. Then it is going to be the Kakama, and the Kakama and the Akaku are very close to each other. After that fact, I think that this one comes later, then the Mask of Fire, and finally the Mask of Jungle, or Liwa's mask. Now, Fire and Water, again, very, very close. All of these masks are quite excellent. I think LEGO did an exceptional job designing these master masks. I really, really like them. And so, if you don't own any of these masks, they are some that I would implore you to go ahead and get. They're thankfully still relatively cheap. You can get them oftentimes for $1 or less, at least for the original 6. Sometimes when you want to shell out for one of the special edition ones, you know, or the polybag one, you might be paying a couple more dollars. But they're all perfectly respectable in price. The ABS means that they've held up quite well over the decades, and especially decades. Yeah, almost a decade. And the colors hold up well also. One other thing I neglected to mention before I end this video is Tahu's mask. Lastly, I have a big issue with CCBS's red. Not all red pieces are bad, But so far, from what I've seen, all of the Tahu Master masks have a very slight pinkish hue to them, and that bothers me. There are a couple of shells that have the same hue as well, meaning that you can use it, and it's imperceptible, nearly, but it is there. And it's more than enough to be bothering, since red is a color that's been around in LEGO for a long time and has, for the most part, stayed consistent. I don't know what it was that caused this pinkish hue, but it's minimal. And I think if you're going to go out of your way, first of all, I don't think any of the hows are different. I think they all have this hue, so at the very least, they're internally consistent. And if you got the mask, I don't think you're going to regret it because of it. Again, it's so subtle, you really have to be looking for it to notice it. But it is there. And it means if you want to use it on a set from 2001 with red, you might notice that little discrepancy. Not a bad thing necessarily, but it would have been nice had it been the proper, true red that we're all used to and all love. With that being said, that's basically going to be the end of this video. If you guys did enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, because it does really help out the channel. And of course, as always, you can join in on the conversation in the comments, on Discord, Instagram, or Patreon if you want to support the channel in the perks, and the links for that will all be in the description below. And I will see you all in the next one. Take care.